If I were a drug smuggler, which happily I'm not, I think the choice would be clear. Hello, friends. Welcome to Type 56, the story of China's army. I'm Jason Clower. This is a course about why the PLA deliberately chose and kept obsolescent weapons, like the Type 56 SKS carbine, and why it undervalued other weapons like the Type 56 AK, or today, their own Type 54 Sudayev submachine gun. That's right. Today we're talking about the Type 79 light submachine gun, 79式轻型冲锋枪, and we're doing it in tandem with Ian from Forgotten Weapons. Friends, you may never have heard of the Type 79 submachine gun, and I congratulate you on that. There is no weapon that ever deserved more to be featured on a channel called Forgotten Weapons, because this thing was a literal student project that racked up more rejection slips than me auditioning as an exotic dancer. The story of the Type 79 submachine gun is a story of tragedy, and not the kind of poignant tragedy that fills you with nostalgia and sentiment about unrealized possibilities. No, the kind of tragedy that helped get 26,000 guys killed in Vietnam when they didn't have to be. One of the through lines of this course has always been how and why the PLA showed up in force in Vietnam in 1979, still rocking SKS carbines and still not realizing the potential of their own Type 56 AK. But a kind of secondary plot line in this general tragedy is the story of the Type 79 light submachine gun, because the PLA really did have an urgent need for a jungle submachine gun, even though only a few jungle warfare specialists in the PLA knew that. Up in Beijing, nobody was really listening. And when they were finally moved by political pressure to pursue some kind of light submachine gun project, they did it reluctantly and ambivalently, and they handed the project to a group of incompetents. And for reasons of splenetic ideology and just national pride, they passed up a very good option that they already had in their arsenal, and that was their Type 54 submachine gun, a Chinese clone of the Soviet Sudayev that had served them very well in Korea. As we'll see, the Sudayev was certainly up to the job. It at least could have been a basis for incremental improvement to give the PLA exactly what it needed in the way of a jungle submachine gun. And they could have done this cheaply, easily, quickly, and effectively. Instead, though, acting out of nationalist pride, the PLA insisted that its incompetent student designers make them a gun that would look nothing like a Soviet submachine gun. So instead of using their own perfectly good Sudayev clone, they added feet to a snake, as they say in Chinese, 画蛇添足. And in fact, they didn't just add feet, they added like 13 tentacles and an outboard motor, and came up with a weapon that Ian will show you was outlandishly overcomplicated for the very simple job that it needed to do, which was just spit some hot Tokarev pistol cartridges downrange. Well, as we'll see today, this project was assailed by every kind of self-inflicted wound, and its only real accomplishment was to stand in the way of the Sudayev and block it from getting onto the field of battle when China really needed it in 1979. At any point that you want, you can click on the link in the show notes to go over to Ian's video where he'll show you in loving detail exactly how this thing is put together. And he'll point out some of the trade-offs or maybe just manifest absurdities in its design. Here in this video, we'll be covering the history of the logic, if we can call it that, that informed this weird design and its unique status as like a cursed bad luck charm in Chinese firearms history, where it seems as though everyone who touched one of these things came to a bad end, except for Ian, I hope. So friends, if you came here today primed for a tale of fiery self-sabotage at a whopping 1,000 rounds per minute, you are in the right place. Today our story begins in a backwater of the PLA, which was the military districts of Guangxi and Yunnan provinces in the southwest of China, bordering Vietnam and the rest of Southeast Asia. I think every military probably has its unglamorous assignments, things that people know are important, but are not the path to glory and do not drive things like military doctrine and arms procurement. In the PLA, these jungle warfare specialists in the Southwest were acknowledged as doing important work. After all, China had deep, deep involvement with Vietnamese communism ever since the Vietnamese had been fighting the French. And certainly nobody expected that China was going to be free of military involvement down there within their lifetime. But these jungle warfare specialists, with their particular needs and concerns, found themselves at odds with big PLA military doctrine. If you're familiar with this channel, you know that the PLA had an ambivalent relationship at best with select fire weapons. They had used submachine guns to terrific effect in Korea. They were using Soviet Papashas and PPSs, Suryevs, and then they cloned their own versions, and they used them successfully in Korea. But as far as they were concerned, submachine guns in Korea had been a kind of one-off, an ad hoc adaptation to special circumstances, and the PLA came home from Korea and basically put submachine guns back on the shelf in what they considered was their appropriate place, which was specialist weapons, things that you give to junior leaders and certain company and platoon level officers. Useful under certain circumstances, but not to be entrusted to the ordinary soldier. They were kind of special purpose things that needed to be in the expert hands of a few select soldiers who had the experience to use the ammunition wisely. Because for decades, overall PLA strategy was that they were expecting to fight wars of defense on their home territory with very little logistical sophistication. This was a tradition that they brought with them from the Chinese Civil War, when their units might be cut off for weeks, maybe even months, from communication with higher headquarters and logistical support. Now, they could get help from peasants in the form of manpower, food, clothing, shelter, intel, but not ammunition. And so we might say that the prime directive for PLA tactical thinking was thou shalt not expend ammunition recklessly. Now, of course, they kept submachine guns in their inventory, but they used the Type 56 AK as their new catch-all submachine gun. It was a little bit overpowered for their tastes, but it was available and useful. And once they had that Type 56 AK in their hands, they more or less purged their inventory of the old Papashas and PPSs. Now, I don't mean that they threw them out, but they relegated them to service as PDWs, personal defense weapons, for some rear echelon troops, and maybe used a few to arm some recon soldiers. But pivotally for our story, they stopped manufacturing their very successful Papashas and PPSs. In fact, when they began manufacturing the Type 56 AK, they did that at Factory 626, the old home of the Type 54 or Suryev submachine gun. So they discontinued manufacture of the Suryev, converted that line to making Kalashnikovs, and they did not plan on ever looking back. However, there was that one group of jungle warfare specialists in the Southwest who felt that the Kalashnikov was grossly overpowered for their needs. Now, they understood what the PLA's Soviet advisors had once taught them in the 50s, which was that in modern warfare, most of the fighting happens at 300 meters or less, and that's why we have intermediate cartridges. And in theory, the Type 56 AK was then a perfect kind of catch-all submachine gun that would fill your automatic fire needs for anything from bad breath distance out to 300 meters. It was perfect for the northern Chinese plains and mountains that the PLA really imagined themselves fighting their battle for the homeland on. But that recipe did not fit jungle warfare. The jungle warfare specialists again and again were telling Beijing, look, it's fine in general to have a weapon that's good for 300 meters and under, but you don't understand. In jungle fighting, we're going to be having engagements at 30 meters or less. In fact, friends, by the way, this is borne out by a relatively recent Australian article that I'll link to in the show notes. So they said having a 7.62 by 39 cartridge in a submachine gun is just ludicrously overpowered. What we really need is a weapon for jungle fighting that's shorter, lighter, won't be so exhausting to carry through foliage as an AK, which is almost 3 feet long. Friends, if you have not hunted in brush with a full-size hunting rifle before, keep it that way. It's a searing experience. And there's a whole new kind of fatigue that comes with trying to wrestle a full-sized long gun through foliage that doesn't like you. So the jungle warfare specialists pointed out something like our old Suryev would be perfect. That 7.62 by 25 Tokarev pistol cartridge is a wicked little number out of a submachine gun. It worked so well for us in Korea, why don't we just bring it back? Now, of course, the answer was, well, we can't. We replaced that production line. It's making AKs now. So the jungle warfare specialists said, well, look, give us something else then. If it's too much trouble for you to revive the Suryev, surely it shouldn't be much trouble to just incrementally improve upon it. Make a new version of it, chop it down a little bit while you're at it, maybe, shave a few ounces off, and we'll be happy with whatever you can give us. We're not asking you to change big armies' whole doctrine about automatic fire, select fire. We just want usefully small, nimble little submachine guns in the hands of our jungle fighters. Because believe you me, with all the action that we're directly or indirectly party to in Southeast Asia, the day will come when we are going to need to fight in jungles, and you do not want to send a bunch of squaddies down there with nothing but Type 56 carbines and SMGs.
Meaning Kalashnikovs.
Well, in Beijing, these guys got a respectful hearing, I'm sure, but nobody was really taking action. This conversation really heated up in 1965. And if you're a viewer of this channel, you know that 1965 was what, friends? The last good year for the PLA as a modernizing, professionalizing force before the gale force political madness of the Cultural Revolution. People already smelled the rotten winds of political carnage coming their way in Beijing, and business was slowing down. Nobody was going to give the time of day to these unglamorous jungle warriors from down south. Now, as time went by, though, there were other commands who had more pull than the jungle fighters, and they too began asking for something like what came to be called the Light Submachine Gun Project, 轻型步枪. One group were the paratroopers. Now, it's important to note, friends, that in Chinese service, paratroopers were and are part of the Air Force, not the Army. In this respect, they work like the Luftwaffe. And in 1965 and 66, the Air Force was the fair-haired boy of the Chinese military because they were the pet service of none other than Lin Biao, China's #2 man, the hand-picked heir to Chairman Mao. Hand-picked by Chairman Mao largely because he was a pliant, spineless sock puppet who would do whatever the chairman wanted, including neutering the PLA. Well, the paratroopers in the Air Force, of course, saw the utility of having a light submachine gun, and so they added their voices to those of the jungle warfare guys. At this point, the Ordnance Bureau had to kind of listen. As a final straw, they also started getting requests from the mysterious spooks in the General Staff Department's Second Directorate. These were the people who were in charge of what we would call covert and black ops with socialist forces on China's periphery, any kind of client state that China wanted to ingratiate itself with, like Vietnam. That was the business of the Second Directorate. And the politically powerful Second Directorate had an image problem that made them interested in this light submachine gun project. See, in 1968, fingers were being pointed at them for helping to supposedly bungle the Tet Offensive. Now, nowadays, in America, we tend to think of the Tet Offensive as this great turning point in favor of North Vietnam. But at that time, in Hanoi and Beijing, the Tet Offensive was actually perceived as a military failure because they didn't just want to turn Western public opinion. They also thought that they were actually going to ignite pro-communist uprisings in South Vietnamese cities. The idea was they were going to send heavily armed communist cadres and insurgents into South Vietnamese cities, and they would erupt with such firepower during the Tet Offensive inside those cities that the South Vietnamese civilian city people would join them. That did not happen, and the casualties that the Vietnamese Communist forces took during the Tet Offensive were so severe that Hanoi and Beijing really thought that this might be the end of their cause or cripple it for the foreseeable future. Up in Beijing, that failure of the Tet Offensive was considered the failure of the Second Directorate. One of the things that they blamed was that China didn't have arms that they could supply to these underground Vietnamese communist agitators in the cities that could be smuggled into the cities under the noses of South Vietnamese authorities. It was one thing to smuggle pistols and ammunition into the cities, but long guns are simply hard to disguise. Friends, I can attest from embarrassing personal experience that you can take a rifle and you can like wrap it in a blanket or something, and it pretty much looks like a gun in a blanket. People know that it's not curtain rods in there. So now the Second Directorate in Beijing, with all of its political clout, started saying, yeah, we want a light submachine gun too, except we want an additional feature. We want it to be so small and so light and so collapsible that you can break it down to something that would really fit into a shopping bag. Get us one of those. So now the Ordnance Bureau really had to act. But I do get the distinct impression that they were not giving it a full-throated, enthusiastic yes either. Why do I think that? Because of the team of aces to whom they assigned this project. Friends, let's do a little quiz in what I like to call socialist business administration. Here's our scenario. Your job is to assign a crack team of designers to come up with a jungle submachine gun. Do you assign that project to A, a group of designers who are near a jungle, B, designers at Factory 626, home of China's Type 56 AK and the best experts China has on submachine guns, or C, to designers in Xi'an, more than half a continent away from the jungle, who consist of a group of one or two actual designers, some graduate students, and graduates of a vocational high school who have never designed a gun before. If you chose A or B, I would prefer that you run any business that I buy from, but in fact, the answer was the self-taught, completely inexperienced Votech students of Research Institute 208. By the way, these days, 208 isn't a joke. They're the home of the QBZ series, but there was a learning curve. The qualifications of these designers were that they showed exemplary political loyalty and a high political consciousness in Mao Zedong thought. That's it. And these self-taught designers did come up with several prototypes. Problem was, none of them could fire bullets. Beijing then said to its customers, we tried. I guess it just can't be done. We're throwing out the project. But over the remainder of the 1960s, they kept getting harried by the Air Force and the spooks of the Second Directorate and the Southern military districts, as if anybody cared what they thought. It's not like they're ever going to fight a jungle war, right? So eventually the ordnance people had to make another show of reluctantly trying to do something along the lines of a light submachine gun. Because now they were also getting harangued by other branches of the PLA who wanted something that we would call a personal defense weapon. And also for reconnaissance troops who hopefully won't be doing a lot of combat, but do need something that's light and nimble and it can spit out a lot of bullets quickly if worse comes to worst. So in 1970, Beijing revived the light submachine gun project. And now the fun really began, friends. This project was pursued with every absurdity in the whole catalog of high Maoist science, technology, and industry. By this point, the Cultural Revolution was at its zenith, though it was far from over. And a great many of China's experienced weapons engineers were dead or in prison camps owing to years of political terror. Even the self-taught design team of 5 years before was scattered now. The lucky ones had gone on to other jobs. The unlucky ones had gone to prison camps. Those personnel had to be replaced, but unfortunately, not by more qualified people. And they were doubly disadvantaged by these cumbersome political taboos. They were expected to create a unique design that would be China's first homegrown submachine gun and break new design ground for the glory of new China. Above all, the designers were given to understand that under no circumstances should they replicate anything Soviet. Friends, if you've been paying attention to this point, you know that the short, hot romance between communist China in the 1950s with the Soviet Union was long over. This was the messiest breakup in 20th century political history. And now China could not stand the Soviet Union. The Soviets were now Chinese enemy number one, leaving the Americans and their Taiwanese running dogs way behind. And since everything in the PLA's arsenal was a Soviet hand-me-down, somebody in Beijing was just mad hot to leave behind Soviet influence. I mean, this would have been a very difficult task, even if the designers had known what they were doing. So now, at Institute 208, it fell to some poor soul to say, in effect, the following. In our Type 54 submachine gun, the highly successful clone of the Sudayev, we have a design whose roots go back to the blackest midnight of World War II. It was produced in Leningrad while it was being besieged by Nazis. It was hailed as a step even beyond the great Papasha, practically a trademark of the all-vanquishing Soviet Red Army and of the PLA's own campaign in Korea. It's become practically an emblem of Maoist ideological purity. In the hands of our propaganda hero, Lei Feng, we know exactly how to produce the Type 54. In fact, at Factory 626, home of the Type 56 AK, we have Zhao Ruizhi himself, the very man who set up the Type 54's production line for the first time. He's still there. Granted, he's being held as a slave for imaginary thought crimes, but that hasn't stopped us from using him to fix the very engineering problems that we created through unqualified Maoist political zealotry and our devotion to the Maoist good idea fairy. Why, we could just reassign Mr. Zhao as the slave engineer in charge of restarting the production of our tried and true, battle-tested, much-loved Type 54 submachine gun. The cost in time and money would be almost negligible. Or, someone must have said, we could reinvent the wheel. We could recapitulate decades of effort by eminently qualified Soviet and Chinese designers, manufacturers, and soldiers. We could invest prodigally in a quixotic quest and gamble against all odds that with ingenuity and good luck and a ruinous expenditure of Maoist magical thinking, that we can somehow create something that's wholly redundant, that needlessly arrives by a new and yet to be discovered road at the very place that we already reached in the 1950s. Why, yes, that's just what we should do. Granted, that's only the best case scenario, and the much more likely outcome is that our unqualified and inexperienced handful of political appointees will fail to come anywhere close to equaling the results achieved by the very Soviet military industry that propelled the idea of conscript forces armed with cheap submachine guns made by intelligently de-skilled mass production to the very zenith of perfection. And probably instead, they'll spend years failing produce a weapon that's capable of even safely detonating a cartridge, much less doing so reliably and without blowing off the owner's face. And all that at a rueful opportunity cost that will ruin the lives and innocence of 10,000s of our soldiers. And it will probably blight the PLA's reputation for generations, all in quest for political vanity. Oh, hell, why not? This frightened team of designers knew that their heads were on the block now. They had to come up with something that didn't copy the Soviets, at least not visibly, and they had to do it quickly. Otherwise, in the climate of the times, they would be tarred as counter-revolutionary saboteurs. So over the next 4 years, they kept churning out prototypes, one little better than the other, but at the very least, they made sure to look busy. They sent several prototypes to the proving grounds, and they failed miserably, but nobody could say that they weren't working hard. The first prototype, they churned out in 2 years. They sent it to the proving grounds at breakneck speed so that they could make a show of coming in before deadline, which in the Maoism of the day was considered very praiseworthy. But not only did that gun fail, it failed like a communist Zeppelin filled with kerosene fumes. If you can think of a kind of mechanical failure, this prototype suffered from it. The usual things like failures to extract, failures to feed, but also just parts going pop and snapping off on the firing line. So they rushed back to the drawing board and they came back in 1974. Fail. Came back in 1975. Fail again. Now, friends, remember, this was happening after close to a decade of Cultural Revolution mayhem when nothing and no one worked correctly. So now, just imagine how bad a submachine gun project has to be that even in the Cultural Revolution, you achieve a level of failure that still manages to become a byword for incompetence by the standards of the Cultural Revolution itself. Eventually, the design team understood there was no way the acorn was going to outgrow the oak. There was no way that with their inexperience, they were going to be able to come up with something better than years of Soviet and Chinese designers and refiners had come up with. If they were not allowed to copy a Soviet submachine gun, they would cheat. First, they changed the outside styling so that it really didn't look like a Papasha or a Sudayev. Now, it did look a heck of a lot like a French Mat 49, but nobody in Beijing knew that. Nobody in Beijing had probably ever seen a Mat 49. So they used that as their exterior form factor. Now, inside, they knew that questions were going to be asked about the gun's internals. They figured the question that they would get from the bosses of the bosses in Beijing was, does this have an operating system anything like a Soviet submachine gun? And they arranged things so that they could truthfully say, no, sir. This operating system is much more advanced than anything that the Soviets have in their submachine guns. You see, sir, Soviet submachine guns use crude direct blowback that rely on nothing more than the mass of their blockish bolt assemblies. But you see, sir, we alone have provided a locked breech system to our submachine gun. It allows us to use lighter parts, shaving weight off the weapon, and it's quite unlike anything found in the Soviet arsenal. Well, there were no actual lies in that. It's true, Soviet submachine guns did not use locked breeches. They didn't need to. What the Chinese designers had done was almost directly copy the internals of the AK with the rotating bolt, which is completely unnecessary for a pistol cartridge, even a hot one like the Tokarev. And they had given their submachine gun this largely superfluous locked breech. Now, Ian tells me that it really does make a difference and give you like that palpable lightness. Their Type 79 submachine gun ended up coming in more than 2 pounds lighter than the Sudayev. That's not nothing. So yes, they could truthfully claim that their locking system was different from and more advanced than the Soviet one. Was it a clone of the AK rotating bolt? Not exactly. Ian shows you the details, but the lugs are kind of backwards on the Type 79 from the AK. And so if you're speaking sort of like Jesuitical precision, it is not technically a copy of the Kalashnikov system. As for its form factor, sure, it largely copied a French design, but Beijing didn't care about being different from the French. They cared about being different from the Russians. In 1978, they finally got this thing through range trials, and late in 1979, it was formally blessed by the General Staff Department and the Central Military Commission, and it was designated the Type 79. It was not without virtues. It really was light. It really was short. It really was quick to get into action. We have a couple of instances of this being used by special forces in Vietnam. In one instance, there was a guard shack occupied, I think, by three Vietnamese soldiers, and one PLA recon ninja ended up jumping into this structure with a Type 79, and he eliminated all three soldiers in a single 20-round magazine because this thing was brisk enough in fire and small and nimble enough that he could actually engage three targets, one, two, three, inside a crowded structure. So, one success for the Type 79. There's also one other account that I've read of a recon element in the Vietnamese theater, camouflaged in an observation post for 3 days and 3 nights. And then eventually they were signaled to return to their parent unit. And when they began to move, it turned out that they were just a couple dozen meters away from a Vietnamese recon element that had been hiding there the whole time also. These two groups discovered each other, and instantly the Chinese wiped out the Vietnamese group without taking any casualties. And I'm told that they credited the Type 79 in this instance, again, because it was small, fast into action, and fast, I imagine, to service one target and then engage another and another. So, okay, two W's for the Type 79. What were the problems? Oh boy, friends, how long do you have? Pretty much everything other than the compact size and weight that could go wrong did go wrong. It turned out the ergonomics were awful because they'd been aimed less at serving the shooter than at making the gun look different from anything in the Russian arsenal. As you'll see in Ian's video, to change mags, you would have to release your firing grip, move your hand forward, and depress the mag release. Then you would reach for a magazine and you would put it into the mag well. Now, there was no impediment to inserting the stick mag backwards so that the bullets were facing you. Only once you'd done that, there was no good way to wrench it back out. But if you got lucky and your mag went in the right way, now you still had to use your firing hand to operate the charging handle. And if it didn't break off, now you could reacquire a firing grip. And as Ian points out, there's nice sort of like buffering around that mag release, but it turned out to be in exactly the right place to get bumped by your hand when you were maneuvering, or even if you were fumbling for the charging handle. So that we've got plenty of accounts of guys doing live fire exercises, like where they're doing buddy rushes. And in the course of these bounds, soldiers would get up, lose their magazine, get down, and then they'd start giving covering fire, only to discover that their magazine was 10 or 20 meters behind them. Not a recipe for success. Now, at this point, if the shooter had actually succeeded in beating the odds and getting his weapon loaded, charged, and aimed, his problems were far from over. First, turned out the Type 79 had a notorious propensity to run away on the shooter, just surprising him by spontaneously changing from semi-auto to full automatic and then burning through the whole magazine. For that matter, it might burn through your whole magazine even if you knew you were on full auto, because this thing had a 1,000 round per minute rate of fire. Insane, and especially unsuitable to a little 20-round magazine. So if I do the math right, I think that comes out to a 1.2 second string of fire before you have to reload and just like roll the dice and hope that that goes well. Of course, the gun might just stop on you too, because the Type 79 was infamous for stoppages of all kinds. Failures to extract, failures to feed, and all they needed to do to create a successful submachine gun was use the traditional, well-tested method of a super simple direct blowback gun. But since they had insisted on a locked breech, and moreover, one copied from the Kalashnikov, which worked great with with rifle ammo, but not so well with round-nosed pistol ammo, they just created a bunch of unnecessary feedway problems. Remember now, the Type 79 internals are a lot like a junior AK. So the AK feedway is wonderful for reliably feeding a relatively long, pointy-nosed cartridge. Turns out that same feedway is too long, too big for this wee little round-nosed pistol cartridge. There's lots of ways for this thing to get loose and go awry in that AK feedway. Another reason for their extraction problems was that the ammo that they had available was not good enough for what they were trying to do with it. In particular, the case head of the Tokarev cartridge was not made to fine tolerances. In the Soviet weapons that it was manufactured for, that was no problem at all. The Tokarev cartridge is such a spicy little habanero that even if you had a cartridge that was a little out of spec in the case head, and the extractor of a Tokarev pistol or of a Papasha or a Sudayev couldn't get a good grab on it, that wasn't a huge deal. Chamber pressure alone was probably going to blow that thing out of there. But the Type 79 design crew were trying to wring more fanciness out of their action than their relatively crudely made ammunition could support. So now they had a design where the extractor had to do its job or the gun would stop. If the gun and its ammo were being manufactured by a Japanese electronics firm, that might have been fine. But if the ammo is actually coming from like number 68 Red Banner pistol ammo and toothbrush factory, where half the engineers and the skilled machinists are in labor camps, that dog ain't gonna hunt. And there were other problems. Even the charging handle gave them fits. See, the reciprocating charging handle on an AK makes great sense. But with the Type 79, the rate of fire was so high that the designers found that the charging handle needed to be as small and light as the gun itself. Otherwise, on this wee little 4+ pound gun that was firing at 1,000 rounds per minute in full auto, a truly substantial charging handle sitting off the bore axis was going to pull the gun sideways and maybe even break things inside. So they thinned down the charging handle and made it light and kind of pointy too. So that partially resolved their problem with having a charging handle that was just too heavy, but it also meant that the charging handle might break off in your hands. It also proved great at tearing up the sleeve of your uniform or even your flesh. Once again, the Type 79 seems to have just like dug deep into the human imagination to find more and more ways that it could malfunction. And the Type 79 did have a tendency sometimes to spontaneously, ballistically auto-deconstruct, which is to say, blow up. I've read one account of an infantryman whose unit was briefly armed with the Type 79 until, during a live fire exercise, one of his buddies fired the weapon and the gas piston just blew the top cover, and then the piston like flew end over end down into a deep ravine and was never seen again. And at this point, the unit's commanding officer decided that the Type 79s were too much of a danger to his own men, and he just had them locked away in the storehouse. If he wasn't authorized to throw them into the junk pile, he would at least keep them under lock and key where they couldn't do any harm. So, did this weapon have any redeeming features? Well, kind of. As a military weapon, it was a complete write-off, beginning with the fact that the designers completely missed the boat on getting this weapon ready for the very war that it was conceived for. Even by the standards of PLA small arm design and rollout, which just operated on glacial time spans, partly because of the relatively underdeveloped nature of Chinese industry and partly because of the size of the PLA itself. Even by those generous standards, this project was unconscionably long and slow. Depending on how you count and where you count from, when the Type 79 came out, it could have been older than some of the soldiers who were to be armed with it. So did the Type 79 actually see action in the Sino-Vietnamese War? The answer is yes, but it's weird and complicated. Normally, in English or Chinese, when we talk about the Sino-Vietnamese War, we're talking about the incursion that happened in February and March of 1979. Now, if you look carefully, you might have noticed that the Type 79 submachine gun wasn't actually formally adopted, 定型, until September of 1979. So, how could it have made it into the war, even in limited numbers? Well, a couple things were going on. First, the Sino-Vietnamese War began in February of 1979. It did not end for pretty close to a decade. There were some hot battles that happened on very large scales with big body counts deep into the 1980s. This is a fact that's not so often remembered in among English speaking or even Chinese speaking people, but in my experience, the Vietnamese people are keenly aware of this fact. So when we do see reports of the odd Type 79 making it onto a battlefield in Vietnam, usually I think in the hands of recon soldiers or other very special troops, it may actually be after the great invasion of spring of 79. The other thing was that for a gun that kept flunking all of its tests, there were a lot of copies of the Type 79 in some developmental form that were already out there long before the gun was formally adopted. There are a few reasons for this. One is that by the time China invaded Vietnam, they, sorry, I'm getting a message from Beijing. 对不起，对不住，我错了，对不起，抱歉。By the time China launched its self-defensive counterattack against Vietnam, even though the weapon hadn't yet been formally approved, it had passed its range trials. And in a weird way, it had kind of been through field trials also, because at some point, the designers really hit a wall and understood that they needed help desperately. And so they took prototypes of the gun out to the field in, I think, 4 different military districts around the country. And they basically did sort of like pre-adoption troop trials where they would get infantry soldiers to use these things on exercises and just give them ideas right there and do a lot of fast on-the-spot iteration. So that means there are already lots of copies of some version of this gun that had been out there in the hands of troops, and presumably a lot of them stayed there. Also, very strangely, there were illicit copies of this in the hands of very highly placed members of the PLA and the Chinese government. The way it worked was that the Type 79 uniquely was involved in not one, but 2 counter-revolutionary coups. And friends, because we're talking about the Cultural Revolution, I should specify that we mean real coup plots, not the kind of imaginary witch hunting that went on every day throughout the Cultural Revolution. No, there were 2 actual takeover plots where the plotters turned out to have copies of the Type 79 that they had illicitly manufactured using plans that were filched from the designers themselves at Institute 208. The first of these instances happened in 1971. One September morning, the PLA shot down one of its own planes over Mongolia. The plane was carrying Marshal Lin Biao, Chairman Mao's number 2 and reliable yes man and sock puppet, and Lin's family. Someone in the Lin family really does appear to have been engineering some kind of coup back in China, with the family on a PLA Air Force getaway plane trying to make it to safety in Moscow before they could have their heads chopped off in China. That plane was shot down in Mongolia and the whole family was killed. And now there was a massive investigation of something truly unprecedented. After years of Cultural Revolution political witch hunting, looking for counter-revolutionaries in every conceivable corner, they actually had some counter-revolutionaries to persecute. Well, investigators found that Lin's cabal inside the PLA Air Force had in their possession plans and specimens, a small armory of prototype Type 79 submachine guns. A gun that wasn't even supposed to exist yet and probably wouldn't fire even if it did exist. So these investigators went to Research Institute 208 and they sat down, the designers of this gun, and they sweated them and said, how in the name of Marx himself did Enemies of the people get your gun. Now, amazingly, these guys had receipts that got them out of trouble. They pulled out of their files a paper trail that showed that some years before, somebody acting in Lean's name from PLA Air Force headquarters had requisitioned from the Research Institute both plans for the work in progress of what was to become the Type 79 submachine gun and two working prototypes. I mean, working to the extent that anything associated with the Type 79 ever worked. And later, they returned the plans and they returned them with little compass holes that showed that draftsmen had made copies. They did not return the prototypes. Somewhere in the PLA Air Force, somebody made a run of these prototype 79 submachine guns. This looked legit at the time because the PLA was in charge of the paratroopers. The paratroopers were involved as a customer for this project, and so it didn't raise too many eyebrows. And if they returned the plans without the guns, well, who's going to ask questions of the office of the number two man in the land? Nobody who wants to go home that night to his family. So, amazingly, these hapless designers might have been the only people in Cultural Revolution history to be accused of treachery and not sent to the gulag. I mean, heaven knows enough innocent people went. Well, that should have been nightmare fuel for a lifetime. Except they didn't have that long. See, just about 5 years later, the investigators came back to Research Institute 208 and said, "You have some more explaining to do." See, after Mao died in 1976, it was payback time. The remaining surviving grown-ups in the Chinese Communist Party finally went and rounded up the radical nut jobs who had surrounded Chairman Mao and egged him on to ever greater feats of national self-destruction in the name of utopian communism. Chief among these was Mao's own widow, Jiang Qing. And among her alleged private army of radical wackos in Shanghai, there was an armory full of guns that looked an awful lot like the Type 79 design in progress. So now, once again, these designers were called on the carpet and shown the guns that had shown up once again in the hands of the bad guys and asked to explain themselves. And this time, something really hysterical happened. The designers took these guns and they're like, "Yeah, these look like ours." And then they open them up and they look and they're like, "Oh, wow, look what they did there. That was really smart. We should copy that." Well, it turned out the bad guys had actually improved the Type 79s that they had gotten from the legitimate designers. Now, these guys were so bad at their jobs that even raving anti-intellectual communist utopian lunatics who in some sense didn't believe in science had still been able to improve on the guns. And as far as I know, those design changes actually made it into the eventual Type 79 design for all the good that did. So amazingly, these guys did not get swung by the ears. Maybe they were just so bumbling that the investigators couldn't believe that they could really be up to no good. But somehow or other, not once, but twice, they dodged bullets. Or maybe the bullets were just meant to be fired from Type 79 submachine guns, in which case, you're safe. The thing will never fire. But the Type 79 actually had kind of a second life as a police gun. Its various vulnerabilities and unreliabilities made it absolutely unsuitable for military use, except for particular reliable specimens in the hands of highly trained troops for special purposes. As a police gun, though, good enough was good enough. If you had a certain number of Type 79s that proved themselves moderately reliable, that was actually good enough for most of the law enforcement needs in China. As we mentioned before, like in our episode about the Type 54 Tokarev pistol, Chinese law enforcement just got the leftovers from the Chinese military arsenal, and they had to make do with what they could. And that was typically
Sufficient.
because the Chinese criminal underworld was a fairly casual affair in most spots, and what violence did occur would happen mostly with clubs and knives. In most of China, if a police officer showed up with a Type 54 pistol, he was miles ahead of any criminal opposition that he might face. That went doubly so if he came with a Type 79 submachine gun. That had certain advantages, if you had a copy that worked, for use as something like a pistol caliber carbine. We saw in the Tokarev episode that one of the problems for police was it's not a good pointer. The Tokarev points naturally low because of that very obtuse grip angle. And anybody who's ever shot a match with a pistol followed by a pistol caliber carbine knows that the long gun is just much easier to use and it's way more precise. If you've seen Ian's video, you know that the sights on the Type 79 are nobody's dream. However, they're quite a bit better than the sights on a Tokarev pistol. And you can do a lot with a long gun just by general body indexing. So if you were a police officer in, say, a standoff with a criminal suspect who maybe is holding a vegetable chopper to the neck of a hostage, a pretty standard Chinese criminal standoff situation, you didn't have to be Annie Oakley to draw a good bead on this guy. And in single fire mode, your Type 79 submachine gun could serve you as something like a little junior sniper weapon. And in fact, I'm told that Chinese police sharpshooters still keep some Type 79 submachine guns in their arsenal and their training regimens for occasions when, say, they have a standoff in maybe a tight urban space and you can't afford to launch a big 150 grain death comet through a park filled with old people doing Tai Chi. This Tokarev round might be an infamous overpenetrator, but it still is going to cause you less problems than this. So the Type 79 has proven accurate enough that if you don't need a big volume of fire and a big running gunfight, it can actually do the job. Over the last 20 or so years, Chinese law enforcement has been moving from leftovers from the military arsenal, like Type 54 and Type 64 pistols, toward things that look like they belong in modern policing. But even now, you'll actually see a lot of Type 79s in Chinese policing. In fact, Ian did me a real solid when he said, you should go out and look at the crazy pictures of Chinese police officers who have bubbaed up their Type 79s. Somewhere out there in the very small world of Chinese firearms accessories, there is some place that is doing a really yeoman job of imitating Tapco by coming up with all kinds of cheesy appendages for the Type 79 for police use. I mean, just every zany thing short of a chainsaw bayonet. I would love to put some of those images up here, but I'm always afraid of putting a foot wrong with image copyrights. So instead, what I think I'm going to do is that in the show notes, I'm going to put the Chinese words for Type 79 submachine gun police use. And then you can run them through Google Images yourself and just feast your eyes on the carnival of Bubba gimmicks that's out there. Also, for police, the Type 79 submachine gun actually did get more play in its intended environment of the jungles of the southern Chinese border regions. That's because in the 1980s, as social control over Chinese citizens lessened and people kind of got a taste for money and foreign currency, Chinese criminals started participating in the heroin trade in the Golden Triangle. And so those particular Chinese law enforcement officers charged with drug interdiction down there, they saw plenty of action. In cases that I've been able to find of the police using the Type 79 in action, mostly in the Golden Triangle, it has had a way of coming up short against the Tokarev, even the humble Tokarev pistol, because of the reliability issues that killed it for military purposes. Here's what I mean. Now, Mostly the criminals were using Type 54 Tokarev pistols. There are exceptions, of course. Whenever we find a case of a very high-profile Southeast Asian gangster, it's likely that we'll find a Type 79 submachine gun somewhere in his orbit. For example, Hong Kong's King of Thieves, Zhang Ziqiang, whose Cantonese name I can't pronounce, but I'll put it on the screen. This man pulled off the triple crown of Hong Kong gangsterism. He pulled off a major heist of Rolex watches. So there's the jewel thief box checked. He knocked over an armored car full of cash at Kai Tak Airport itself. Okay, so armored car robbery, check. Then he pulled off what I think might be the world's most profitable kidnapping for ransom by snatching the son of a huge Hong Kong tycoon and netting, I think, over $100 million in ransom. Wow. So you can see why they call him the King of Thieves. Now, even more incredibly, he got caught by Hong Kong authorities, and the Hong Kong Crown Prosecution Service released him. It seems that they did not have enough evidence to meet the exacting standards of their judicial system. So, did Zhang Ziqiang turn now to a life of prayer and penitence and enjoying his ill-gotten gains like on an island in the South Seas? No. He went back to crime, and this time he fled into the worst conceivable place, which was China proper. And there he found that the Chinese criminal justice system is much less sentimental and much more brisk than their cousins in Hong Kong. He was arrested by mainland authorities. In 3 months, he was tried and convicted, and 3 weeks after that, he was executed in the traditional communist fashion of a bullet in the back of the head. Even though the Type 79 submachine gun didn't figure actively in his capers, I'm told that he had at least one in his arsenal. And it shows up elsewhere here and there in kind of like cameo roles in Southeast Asian gangsterism, but not as often as the Type 54 pistol and not as successfully. So let's look at instances then when police officers with Type 79 submachine guns got outgunned by Tokarev pistols. I've heard tell of one case of a Chinese drug enforcement officer in the Golden Triangle getting killed because his Type 79, he'd shot it empty and he had no idea that he was holding an empty gun because it did not have a bolt hold open. So, the way I've heard it told, which may or may not be reliable, the way I've heard it told, he had time and opportunity to reload, uh, but he didn't because he didn't know that he needed to. And then he went to engage a suspect who shot at him and his gun didn't fire because it was empty. Now, is it fair to blame that on the gun rather than training or tactical doctrine? I don't know. But I'm told that in Yunnan province, the police kind of counted that as an L for the Type 79 and blamed his death on the gun. Is that conclusive? No, and I don't have enough details about the incident. So let's go to a better documented one, kind of an infamous case. The death of a police captain. That's a rough equivalency of police rank, named Wu Guanglin. He and two other officers confronted two armed suspects in an engagement that should have favored them. They had surprise, and at least on paper, they had superior armament. Between the three of them, they had two Type 64 pistols. Those are a bit like a 32 ACP. Not the greatest gun, but they also had a Type 79. The drug smugglers that they ambushed had a pair of Type 54 Tokarevs. And this fight ended up going very badly for the police and their Type 79. Captain Wu was the head of drug enforcement in his county. And in the Golden Triangle, I think that means that he had seen a lot of stuff and knew a lot. But one morning in August of 2004, he was coming off an operation when he got intelligence about two suspected drug smugglers who were muling drugs down a rural highway. Without eating or resting, he grabbed two other officers, including one young officer with a Type 79 submachine gun, and took them to drive ahead of the anticipated route of the smugglers and set up an ambush in a lonely part of this rural road. They entered an ambush position, waiting for the two foot mobile suspects to come, and they waited and waited and waited. A full 6 hours until it was dark and misty, and finally they saw the approach of two figures in the darkness. Now, by this point, the sky was dark in a way that's only possible in a rural jungle, and the air was filled with mist, so that flashlights alone were not going to provide them the opportunity to illuminate the suspects from a distance and try to identify them. So Captain Wu made a dangerous but calculated gamble. He would let the suspects approach him and his two men, and then he, Captain Wu, would step out of cover and identify himself. He would be protected on either side by his colleagues who could step out and cut the trail in front of and behind the suspects. It was far from perfect, and it was very dangerous to get that close to suspects who they believed to be armed drug smugglers. But it seemed to be the only thing to do without giving these guys a chance to bolt into the jungle, after which point they would never be found again. It was a gamble. Captain Wu was a very experienced officer and probably knew even more about jungle combat than I do. So I'm not going to second guess him, but it did not go well. The smugglers, because that's who they were, they must have been taking advantage of the darkness to walk with their pistols already in hand. So the instant that Captain Wu stepped out and said, "Stop, police," he was shot in the head. Right after that, his two colleagues opened fire on the two suspects. They got fire in return. One of the cops was wounded quite badly. And then the two suspects dashed in the fourth uncovered direction and got back into the jungle. Now, at this point, the young officer who had been holding the Type 79, Yang Jiasheng, he assessed the situation and it did not look good. He was pretty sure that he had hit his guy, but that definitely hadn't stopped him from running. And now both of the suspects were somewhere in the jungle, clearly with firepower that they knew how to use. On the ground where the suspect had been, he saw a 10-pound bag of heroin, which meant that this guy already had a death sentence waiting for him if he were caught. He and his colleague, the drug smuggler, had no incentive to be taken alive. And next to that bag of heroin was a hand grenade. This is how gunned up the heroin smugglers of the Golden Triangle were. Now, friends, let me just point out, these drug smugglers clearly have access to most any weapon they want if they've got grenades. Why did they choose Tokarev pistols? Because that's what they had. If they got a grenade, I'm sure that they could have gotten a Kalashnikov, they could have gotten a Type 79 submachine gun, if that's what they thought would give them an advantage. But no, they chose the Type 54. Why? Well, let's keep that in mind as we talk. Now, at this point, the young officer who had been holding the Type 79, Yang Jiasheng, is now in a pickle. He thinks he's wounded his man, but he and the other suspect are now at large in a jungle, maneuvering in God knows what way onto Officer Yang and his two colleagues. His commander is unresponsive and dying from a mortal head wound. His other colleague has also been hit severely with at least one Type 54 pistol round, and he is not ambulatory. Officer Yang now tries to get communications. And the best he can come up with is a cell phone with just an intermittent signal. So, with nothing better to do, he reloads his Type 79, loggers up as best he can with the two casualties, and then waits and listens. And he ends up waiting there for a very sweaty 40 minutes until he's relieved by, this is amazing, a patrol of villagers whose homes are some distance away, who heard the gunfighting. And amazingly, they formed a patrol of 40 plus volunteers, a few militiamen with real weapons of some kind, and 40 civilian villagers who go out with sticks and axes to find whoever the good guys are and do for them what they can. They give first aid to Captain Wu, who doesn't survive the encounter. They do manage to save the other wounded officer. They bring in help, and reinforcements now comb the jungle, and they find one of the two suspects. It turns out that Officer Yang was right. When he emptied his Type 79, all 20 rounds, just in a somewhat panicked single burst, he hit the guy in both hands and mangled them. However, and this is amazing, that suspect who had just shot Captain Wu then exchanged fire with Officer Yang, who was shooting back at him on full automatic and gave him five, count 'em, five bullet wounds to the upper extremities. That criminal now had the presence of mind to turn onto the third officer and hit him too. So, this one suspect with a single Tokarev pistol and 9 shots, presumably he had 8 in the mag and 1 in the pipe, successfully engaged one police officer, killing him instantly, engaged a second police officer who shot at him on full auto and hit him 5 times, and yet returned fire at that officer enough to neutralize him, and then turned and engaged a third target, and then fled, leaving only a 10-pound bag of heroin and a grenade. That is gangsta. It's evil, but it's gangsta. And that criminal chose a Tokarev pistol over a Type 79 submachine gun? Amazing. Here's another episode from that same region that might tell us more about why. In 1998, again in the Yunnan border region, part of the Golden Triangle, 3 Chinese police officers fought 3 drug smugglers. The cops had a pair of Type 79s. One of the 79s malfunctioned right away and never entered the fight effectively. The other Type 79 instantly burned through its whole magazine, and with no time to reload, the officers were now defenseless against the 3 smugglers. One of the smugglers was in the act of throwing a grenade at them, something about grenades and Chinese smugglers in the Golden Triangle, and the 3 cops thought fast and then effectively suppressed Grenade Guy with the rapid and accurate deployment of the only weapon they had left, which was a bunch of rocks that they picked up off the ground. This smuggler apparently did not have the medal of the criminal who murdered Captain Wu, because he was driven off by the rocks, even though he had a hand grenade. Still, that is not a win for the Type 79. A pair of Type 79s should have murdered these guys. Somehow, it did not happen. The picture that's forming now might be that the Type 79 should be an upgrade from the Type 54 Tokarev pistol on paper, but in actual practice, it seems not to be stacking up that way. Okay, so let's remind ourselves. What are the advantages supposed to be of the Type 79 submachine gun? Okay, it's portable. Well, the Tokarev is portable too. It's concealable. True, but so is the Tokarev. In fact, it's so concealable that our drug smugglers, the ones who murdered Captain Wu, probably had it in their hands before they were even challenged by Captain Wu. Okay, well, the Type 79 still has better sights and it's easier to index a long gun, right? So it should have better combat accuracy by far than the Type 54 Tokarev. But where have we seen that accuracy in all these anecdotes? Only one person has actually been hit with a Type 79 yet. Instead, the Type 79 keeps falling down because of reliability. Sure, it's reliable enough for a kind of sniper style standoff against some wacko in an apartment complex who's holding a cleaver of a hostage, God forgive him, but it does not seem capable of actually gunfighting. If it goes bang at all, it gives its user 1.2 seconds of pray and spray, and then he's done with that weapon. Whereas in the case of the Tokarev, not only have we seen it make very effective combat hits, but we've also seen multiple combat reloads from the Hong Kong gangsters on this thing. Okay, the magwell's not flared. The mag release is a little far for my thumb. So what? We have ample evidence to show that criminals are successfully reloading again and again and again so quickly that they can actually use that Type 54 for suppressive fire, even against opponents with long guns. Okay, you might say, but what about those cases where the longer barrel of the Type 79 submachine gun, assuming one that's been well selected and actually works, and the user is trained enough to become competent in reloads? What about those cases where the longer barrel and the theoretically superior accuracy allow the good guys to outfight criminals with pistols? Well, we have a case like that. And the short answer is at that range, a well prepared criminal is going to have an intermediate caliber long gun of his own and suppress your Type 79. To wit, the infamous example of an incredible siege that happened in 1992 in a place called Pingyuanjie. This was a part of, we're just going to call it part of the Golden Triangle. There was a town that had been completely taken over by drug gangsters. Lawful authorities had been swept right out. Police dared not enter. The gangs were a law unto themselves. It was a town without law. Finally, the Chinese authorities decided this is exactly why we have the 武装警察, the Wujing, what they call the armed police, a kind of paramilitary for law enforcement purposes force. And they did a full scale siege of Pingyuanjie. Now, the center of resistance in Pingyuanjie was this great big fortified mansion. And when I say fortified, I don't just mean like they put some sandbags in the windows. I mean, it was designed as a fortress with mutually reinforcing strong points, overlapping fields of fire, areas for mounting heavy weapons, and among other things, it was also bristling with plenty of Type 81 dash assault rifles, which by that point was the general issue weapon of the PLA. That finally took over from the tired old Type 56 carbine. We'll cover that one in a later episode, but it was really quite superb for what it was. Well, when the People's Armed Police showed up with their Type 79 submachine guns, which were supposed to be not too much, not too little, just right for urban warfare. What they got was a face full of Type 81. So now you get one of these classic situations. If I remember correctly, things like this happened in Panama too, where the good guys have these submachine guns, but they're outranged and outshot by bad guys who have larger cartridges with a longer effective range. Then on top of that, the police's 79s were still suffering stoppages. You would think that if you knew that you were going to war against narco traficantes, that you would at least take your Type 79 to the range and make sure that this one worked. Well, sometimes you never catch a break, and that is the story with the Type 79. The Type 79s ended up having clearly not enough power, not enough magazine capacity, not being fast enough to reload, not even having enough accuracy in burst fire, which theoretically was one of its pluses, and they were stopping so frequently that you could not reliably maintain a steady fire. So all these reasons, I suspect, come together to explain why even a drug smuggler who could have any choice of weapons that could be found in Southeast Asia would still choose a Tokarev pistol over a kind of chancy Type 79 submachine gun. Or to paraphrase an American saying, I'll take 8 rounds for sure out of a Tokarev over 20 rounds, maybe from a Type 79, and maybe it'll blow up on you. And even if it does fire in 1.2 seconds, it's gone and you'll never get the thing reloaded. If I were a drug smuggler, which happily I'm not, I think the choice would be clear. If the curse of the Type 63 is that its improved form was never given an honest shot because its predecessor did legitimately shoot the face off a bunch of friendly soldiers, then the curse of the Type 79 is that everybody who touched this thing was embarrassed by incompetence and lameness. The designers were supposed to be breaking glorious new ground for China's national image, but they were a complete embarrassment to the country. Why didn't they use some of their real designers? Well, because they were in slave labor and it was the Cultural Revolution. But they could have. The poor testers at the National Army Proving Grounds who turned this thing down 4 times must have been talking to each other saying, is there some polite way that we can just tell these guys that it's not going to happen and they should just go home? I feel like kind of cruel, always smacking them down. The counter-revolutionary plotters who can camouflage themselves in about a billion falsely accused suspects of counter-revolutionary treachery who somehow still manage to actually get caught. The poor police officers in the Golden Triangle who had to risk their lives using this completely unlovable hand-me-down. That's the curse of the Type 79. It turned out to be a magnet for incompetence. And if you were ever caught in a 10-meter radius of one, probably something bad and dumb was going to happen to you. That's why I'm very grateful that Ian took the risk for us. Thank you, Ian. Me, I just hide here safely in my literal book-lined study and talk to you about what I love best. Friends, this has been Type 56, the story of China's army. I'm Jason Clower. If you like this sort of content, please subscribe. Please watch our other videos. You might even consider visiting our Patreon page, but this course remains free to all the world's workers, soldiers, and peasants. I will see you next time.